Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to our DNS Hygiene webinar. It's really great to have you all here with us today. My name's Leanne Kenny. I am Global Industry Relations Manager for EMEA at Markmonitor, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Mo and Ivan from DMARC Manager. So I'm just going to do a really quick introduction to Mo and Ivan. Mo is an implementation consultant and has been part of the team since 2019. He's based in the United Kingdom and has a strong background in deliverability. He helps organizations deploy email authentication standards to protect against spoofing and improve inbox placement. Mo also works really closely with clients to improve not just technical configurations, but also the underlying processes that support long-term authentication and policy management. In his role as security officer, Mo is deeply engaged in matters of data privacy and information security, and he's passionate about education and often takes the lead in guiding customers through best practices for compliance. Ivan is an implementation consultant, having joined the team in 2023. Operating from Bulgaria, Ivan brings decades of experience working with email, which he uses to guide customers towards DMARC enforcement. He's known internally as the post-fix guru, and Ivan has a well-earned reputation for architectural expertise and precise troubleshooting in MTA configuration. Ivan combines a deep technical understanding of protocols with a pragmatic problem-solving approach, whether he's diving into mail headers or refining infrastructure for demanding enterprise environments. Ivan brings extensive knowledge and experience to the table. So I think you'll agree that we are in very safe hands with our two experts, Mo and Ivan, today. There will be time for questions. If you do have questions, please do put those in the Q&A. And we also have a poll for you. So it's interactive, so we really encourage you to take part in the poll too. We've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to pass over to Mo to take it away. Mo, over to you.
Thank you very much. So good morning, good afternoon, and in case anyone is watching in the evening, good evening. So we're going to go over domain hygiene, protecting your brand from mismanaged DNS. Ivan will basically step in when he needs to or wants to add some additional information and useful information. So if we start, so first one is the key terms, because of course, if this is your first time looking at DNS, then let's get some key terms through. So these are a few, they're not all of them, but the first one and the most important one is DNS. So DNS is an acronym. It stands for the domain name system, and basically it's the internet's telephone book. So it's taking the computer name and basically translating it to the human readable name. So it takes the IP address and then there's like a web address. Then the second key term is the DNS resolver. So when you're basically going to a website, there's things that happen in the background, and one of those things usually involves the DNS resolver. So that's basically the first stop for going to that place, web address, service, whatever it is. Third is the authoritative name server. So this one's even more important because this is what actually holds the official DNS records. So like your passport holds your official name and some information, this is basically the thing that holds the official DNS records of your website, your email configuration, things like that. Fourth point is from the name server, we basically have this thing called resource records, and that's basically the DNS records itself. Resource records exist from A records to TXT records to MX records, and there's a whole bunch more. And then in terms of what we obviously want to discuss today, the most important ones are SPF, DKIM, and DMARC DNS resource records. They can basically be text records or CNAMEs, but in essence, all three of these are email authentication protocols. And finally, but not least, time to live. So a lot of people refer to this as TTL. It's basically how long a DNS record should be refreshed. So basically, in essence, what you're doing is you're saying how long or how much time you want to take before you fetch the record again in case of updates and things like that. So in terms of the key terms, let's actually go into the idea of, okay, so in terms of mismanaged DNS and all of those different types of scenarios, how can a bad actor basically take advantage of my organization using critical infrastructure, which is DNS itself? There are many open source tools that are basically free, tools that you can purchase, tools that basically do things from a passive perspective, but also from an active perspective, i.e. penetration testing, for example. So here is a tool. If you're interested, you can ask me the question and I will give you the tool. Basically, what it does is it does DNS reconnaissance and research. So it's passive. It basically takes the DNS records and builds a picture. So PlayStation is probably a recognized brand. I definitely recognize it because I'm a video gamer, so it's something that I'm interested in. And basically using this tool, I am now looking for key elements when it comes to the brand, because if I'm a bad actor, I need to basically find the weak points. And like I said, there's tools out there that can do this. So it's important to try and get into the mindset of these bad actors. One key element is we obviously understand how this works, right? So literally what I'm going to show you now is something that anyone can do with these free tools. Bear in mind, it's passive, it's not active, it's not penetration testing. So you don't need to be an expert. So first thing is, this is the domain name itself. So this is the critical asset of any organization, because you have websites, emails coming from this domain name, as well as subdomains, of course. Next part is when it comes to these types of tools, you can basically see, for example, based on those DNS records, because that's what it's using to build that picture, you can already see who the network providers and hosting providers are. So for example, there's names of Microsoft, for example, Sony themselves have their own infrastructure. They use Amazon, they use Salesforce and Amazon SES, for example. And on the right-hand side here, you can see, for example, again, if you're technically familiar, you can see, for example, some sort of services and even operating systems that they are using themselves. So if I'm a bad actor, I've got these tools, I'm trying to basically abuse PlayStation, I can then use these tools, because these tools are showing me, for example, how many DNS records were able to be found using this public service or public tool. And if I look at the part that is showing me here, it's the A records. So for example, the addresses related to web services in some cases. So here, for example, I can see different domain names. I can see different IP addresses with the hosting provider. If it's part of an IP net block, who it belongs to. So if I wanted to, I can take this number, do a search on a search engine, and it will come up with the network owner. Again, you can see who that is here as well. And usually there's some useful information here. But if I'm trying to, for example, spoof their domain name because we're interested in email, in phishing, then I'm trying to identify who they're using in terms of their suppliers. So here, in terms of the text records that I can see, they, for example, on the PlayStation.com domain name itself, I can see they use Office 365 and there is this IP address here that belongs with 87. And then if I'm continually digging in, hopefully you can see this on the right hand side here, there's more subdomains, but now it gets into the nitty gritty, because now I can see, for example, that they're using Microsoft information services. So IIS, I can see operating systems, I can see database technologies, all of this stuff that is publicly out there. We can gather this type of information and basically leverage it. So if I carry on, something that this tool does is it builds that picture with the DNS record. So it's telling me, for example, with the A record as a DNS resource record, these are all of the domain names associated with it, IP addresses, and I can basically, as a bad actor, leverage my technical expertise to say, okay, I see a weak point here. For example, it's on DMARC p equals none, for example, so therefore it's unprotected. And then I can basically try and carry out a phishing or spoofing campaign. When it comes to DNS, if I know who the, for example, supplier is, I can go on LinkedIn. I can find people's job profiles associated with that organization and then try and carry out, again, social engineering and things like that to try and, brute force or try and engineer them into giving their username and password away. Usually their username and password, or at least their username is, for example, their company email address. So that was a real world example of basically how to identify, one, your DNS records, potential gaps in your infrastructure, and then basically try and hopefully from a defensive perspective plug those gaps. If you're an attacker, then of course you want to try and leverage those gaps and use it to your advantage. So from that, we come to the security challenges and scenarios associated with DNS. So there's many, but we're going to focus on three important ones. The first one, I think, is understandable. It happens a lot. There's a real world example that I'll show you is unauthorized access. And that's basically the unauthorized access to the accounts to actually manage those DNS records themselves. So that's your IT technician, for example, your DNS admin, all those types of people that have access to those critical infrastructure. The second is mismanaged DNS. So this is a hierarchical term because there are specific types of mismanaged DNS attacks scenarios like dangling DNS that we're going to look into. But a typical common one that we see is wrongly added values in the SPF records. So for example, you have an SPF record, there's IP addresses in there, for example, that you have had from decades ago, you don't use it now, but it's still left in there, and that's a potential gap for someone to leverage to basically spoof your domain name. And then the third one is DNS hijacking. It's more sophisticated. It has happened, and that's basically where you're redirecting users to malicious sites by actually either poisoning DNS, taking over DNS, and modifying the actual domain name system of that organization. So first one is unauthorized access. So basically, this is where the attack vector is emanating from compromised login details, right? So user access controls are super important here. And a key term that you're going to see is remembering that DNS is critical infrastructure, because it could literally mean the life and death of some organizations, depending on obviously what vertical, what sector you're in. So this is probably one of the least types of scenarios, situations, security challenges that people think about. It's the most common one, and it's one of the most important ones. So here is a real world example. So I look back, and basically this article from the BBC, so you can look this up with the URL, dates back to 2013, so 12 years ago. And basically what happened was there was obviously the New York Times. Some of you actually might remember this. So the New York Times had a IT supplier, and that IT supplier basically blamed the breach on a reseller. So a third party that basically was selling domains through the company's IT system. And the issue here was the reseller's login credentials had been obtained. And that, of course, can allow them to do all sorts. So remember, that there are certain things that they could have done here that we actually talk about later on, like detection, mitigation, and prevention methods. So, they clearly were lacking in one of these areas, because otherwise this would not have happened. So this is a real world example of unauthorized access. Next one is mismanaged DNS. So first type in terms of what we have is an attack that basically is emanating from not knowing your DNS records inside out. And because you don't know exactly what is inside your DNS, that is what leads to a potential compromise. And again, it's critical infrastructure, so it could mean the life and death for some of these organizations. And if we look at it from an email perspective, DMARC as a protocol itself, obviously without the DMARC monitoring in place, these types of attacks would be literally undetectable. Because you have DMARC as a reporting mechanism as part of the protocol itself, you can basically detect these issues, especially as we'll see later on, when the issues are not as bad or as severe. Before they become severe, you have an opportunity to basically stop them. And in terms of information security, obviously not knowing your DNS records inside out is a potential risk. So if we carry on with the example, so this is a example of a DNS zone that basically has example DNS records. So for testing purposes, for example, and what I'm going to do is publish a poll. So if everyone can please answer the poll, and please be honest, because I am expecting a certain answer to that poll. And if anyone says yes, obviously jokes aside, you might need to be followed up, because I expect this answer to literally be no. for this reason alone. So if we look at this example here, if you're an organization and you have these types of records, so there's SPF records here, for example, there's an A record here, do you actually know what all of these records are and who they're used by and used for? Usually the answer is going to be no, because if you are not the person that's managing all of these services, suppliers, in terms of DNS records, you're not going to know. You're never going to know. So here, if you look here, there's 34 records in this zone, but there is a zone, and this is from a production DNS zone, that contains 767 records. So this person that is responsible for this zone will never, ever in their entirety know what every single one of those records is for. Because at the end of the day, some of these records are understandable by machines, not by humans. So for example, this IP address here, 1.2.3.8, of course, it's an example. But if you have a real world IP address, you're not going to know what it is unless you're some sort of human machine type of combination, or you actually know from the top of your head what the IP address points to. So please, do give us feedback on the poll. So there you go. Okay, so this, from that example with this situation, is what happened to an actual customer that we know. So basically, the customer's SPF record had an over-authorization of IP addresses, and those IP addresses are what basically led to the abuse. So here, we can definitely assume that these IP addresses that you basically see here, they are obviously shared servers or dedicated servers taken by the bad actors. The organization here basically forgot to remove the outdated DNS entries. So the DNS entries, the IP addresses that basically allowed the abuse to occur, they in essence forgot to remove them. And in some cases, the attack can actually stem from typo domains. So you, with your SPF record, as a good example, you have, for example, an include that says, I want you to refer to, example.com. But in the actual spelling of example.com, you forgot to have the P in there, for example. If that domain name is available to be purchased and you have obviously authorized it in your SPF record, I'm a bad actor. I can go to basically a reseller of that domain name, purchase it, and then I've got access to that domain name. You are obviously authorizing it, so I can leverage that to basically pass SPF and DMARC. And this, in essence, is what happened here. So if we have a look, it basically shows, and of course we've hidden the actual domain names, but as you can see here, there's an A record with a host name here, and then there's another A record with the actual host name as well. But if you look, these host names authorized IP addresses, IP4, IPv6 addresses, but in the second one, you can see how many IP addresses are basically authorized. And in some cases, these are individual IP addresses where you can see the /32. In another case, you'll basically see IP ranges where there are thousands of IP addresses. So this is basically authorized abuse, because even though you don't necessarily were meant to have this in your SPF record, the fact that you've added it is basically authorizing the abuse to occur. So again, if I'm a bad actor, I can basically leverage this using like DNS Reconnaissance. So what happens when you actually authorize the abuse? First off is in a DMARC reporting platform, as long as it basically can show you the data, you can basically see here, for example, the number of actual email addresses, the number of actual emails that were sent in terms of the volume, from how many IP addresses and how many domain names that were basically spoofed in terms of the visible from domain. So something at something.com. Here is basically where it tells us that the abuse that occurred was basically passing DMARC because of what I showed before, the fact that they over-authorized their SPF record. So of course, if you have an SPF record that over-authorizes, SPF will pass in terms of DMARC compliance, and of course, DMARC will then pass. So what's important to see is that before the period, so at the beginning of March, up until towards near enough the third week of March, there were very, very small volumes. You can literally see that here. What they should have noticed if they were effectively monitoring the data is basically seeing that there's an increase in volume. And this they should have noticed and then investigated. Because what happens afterwards is that the attacker is basically testing the waters, so to speak. So they're seeing if anything happens. And usually this is just one to test the infrastructure, see how much goes through, see if there's any responses to, for example, if they've included web pages, to lookalike web pages to organizations, to gather, email addresses, passwords, and things like that. So they've done that, and then it basically goes silent here. And then what happens is they actually do the actual physical run, or the true production run, so to speak. Because if I go back, sorry, if you look at the volume down here, on one day, it's pretty much 750,000 messages that were sent. And this is on a weekend. So where usually people are going to be relaxed, not so focused because they're worried about the coming day, for example, in the working week. This is literally something that comes from social engineering. So here again, this is the overarching view. But then if you look at the individual view, you can see, for example, this one day where they literally sent 750,000 messages on a weekend, and then it basically died down. If you look at then the details of the over-authorization of the SPF record, again, this is from a different example. But if you have a look here, the volume is 2.3 million, 46 unique IP addresses, 93,000 domains that they send the emails from. Again, SPF is passing, DMARC is passing. But what you now see, for example, is the actual server names that they had set up. So of course, this is not something that they do without planning, because they have to set up the infrastructure to basically send the emails. And what they're doing here is in the abuse industry, something referred to snowshoeing. So snowshoeing is, for example, spreading the email volume across multiple different IP addresses and multiple different servers, for example. Most people would say it's basically spreading the volume across IP addresses, but what they've done here is spread the volume not just across IP addresses, because you can see the unique number of IP addresses, but it's also the unique list of servers. And of course, all of this is passing SPF and passing DMARC, which in most cases would mean that the message would be delivered to the intended recipient. Okay, so now we go on to the very specific type of mismanaged DNS, which is basically called Dangling DNS. So this is a specific type of attack vector. So this is an attack that basically emanates from mismanaged DNS, whether it's SPF records, whether it's basically pointing to other DNS resource records like CNAMEs, where one domain name points to another host name via CNAME record. It doesn't matter. It's basically a specific attack vector that utilizes domain names pointing to other DNS records. And that is what allows the bad actors to basically hijack your domain name. So what does this look like? So this is from the Learn Microsoft portal, but basically it's mostly associated with subdomains. So subdomain takeovers are very common. They're a high severity threat for organizations, and usually because subdomains are in the same DNS zone as the parent domain. So they're somewhere in those 767 records. They're usually not in a separate DNS zone. And that basically, is what allows you to create, delete those DNS resource records, but it gets overlooked. So what happens is you've basically got a subdomain, a legitimate subdomain that once upon a time pointed to another legitimate subdomain or hostname. And that, of course, once upon a time is perfectly fine, normal, it's all okay. But what happens is, let's say the host name or the domain name that you're pointing to is an organization, is a supplier that no longer exists. They go out of business. Because you still have that pointing of your subdomain, which is this one here, to their domain name. If I'm an attacker, and again, I see that subdomain, that domain name is purchasable, I will purchase it. And because you are pointing to that subdomain, I now have that in my control. And that's basically the dangling part, because the dangling part is you are leaving that hook in your DNS pointing to that other host name. And basically that, for example, in this case, it says the website resource record was deprovisioned. Yes, that's usually the case. The supplier goes out of business, so there's nothing there. And then because the attacker purchases the domain name, or they get the domain name by other methods of hijacking DNS, poisoning DNS, for example, unauthorized access, they now have control. And that's basically is where the subdomain is taken over. So what does that look like? So again, in this example, the customer's domain name, so they had a subdomain, a very specific subdomain, so e-learning So of course, something to do with education, probably internal organization education. It was literally a subdomain. It was obviously compromised because that subdomain was pointing to this domain name. And this domain name, once upon a time, was legitimate. There was an organization behind it. Again, if you really want to get into the nitty gritty, you can use passive DNS to basically look back on the DNS history of the ssi.microworldnova.com domain name. So here, again, using, for example, free tools on the internet, you can do a DNS query and you can see that this customer's domain name points to this SSI subdomain. And again, if you are interested in the details, which are important, because here is where the SPF record is of the domain name that the attacker controls, the ssi.microworldnova.com. And as you can see here in the SPF record, it looks very straightforward. There are two host names that they are basically authorizing, flag pastry and repusers.com. So when you start digging into this, you then see this stuff. And there are literally slash 25 ranges of IPs, which are like 128 IPs, but then it even goes even higher. So this is the actual SPF record of that flag pastry that they have authorized in the SPF record of SSI. So here there's multiple IP ranges, multiple host names with, again, another SPF record inside that also has IP addresses. And these are basically authorized IP addresses because of that dangling part of DNS. And here it looks legitimate. There's a Google site TXT verification record. There's also an SPF record here as well. Again, similar in its capacity, multiple IP ranges to allow that email to be sent over those different servers infrastructure that the attackers basically control. Okay, so I've just decided to publish the results, and we actually have one vote that said yes, they do know every single DNS record and what each of those records are for. So I did not expect that, but I'm assuming your zone is not as complicated then. So well done. If it is, even more of a well done. And yeah, 90% of people basically said no. So that's what I was expecting. So if we carry on, so in this example, it's again a different example. 401,000 messages were sent on a single day, again from more IP addresses, 315 unique IP addresses, but the actual spoofed domain names that were used as part of the email abuse was basically only 3,155. So yeah, and you can actually see in some platforms, for example, the actual geolocation of where those servers infrastructure are sending their abuse from. So in this case, it's basically, if I'm not mistaken, America. So now we go on to actually how to protect from DNS abuse. And of course, this includes hijacking and misusing of the domain names. So there are three steps, three scenarios, three processes, three methods. First one is detection, second one is mitigation, and third one is prevention. And they are in the order of importance. So if we look at detection, so there are 4 points here, and I will mention which one, in my view, is most important. Ivan might have a different opinion. So if you do, Ivan, please let us know. So first point is monitoring the traffic with DMARC reports. One, DMARC is an open protocol. It's free. You don't need to use a reporting platform. If you can receive the reports yourself, typically to a mailbox, if you can understand the reports, which is where usually people use platform, then great, because at least then you can, for example, check for spikes in email volume that are suspicious, that you did not expect, from IP addresses that you did not expect, from geolocations that you did not expect. So this is one of those detection methods. Second one is with your DNS solution, whether, for example, you're using Markmonitor or others, is actually monitoring your DNS for unusual behaviors. And those unusual behaviors might be, for example, redirects, SSL mismatches, unfamiliar redirects, but it could be how many DNS records, are being created in a day, in a week. If it's, again, uncommon, that could be a signal for suspicious, unusual behavior. It might be, you've had a new supplier, but you as a person that's responsible for it might not know, because communication, unfortunately, might be lacking in the organization. So therefore, you need to have that process that organizational process to basically be aware of that. But that could be also a detection method. Third one is to actually review the DNS resource record itself. And of course, if you have 767 records, that will take a lot of time. And this is where the fourth point, in my view, is most important: documentation. You can never ever go wrong with documentation. When you have to onboard new suppliers, onboard new DNS resource records, usually people lack the documentation aspect. If you have the documentation aspect from the beginning, when you're adding new records, you usually won't have a suspicious record or unauthorized changes, of course, if your access control protocols and processes are in place. But if you document the resource record, the supplier name, for example, what it's being used for, email, web, stuff like that, then you're on a pretty good footing to basically, whether it's me, Ivan, or someone else that has access to the organization's DNS, to know when I come in, okay, this record is this important. Of this importance is used by this supplier, okay, we can't remove it. But if I know, for example, supplier B is no longer used, then I can automatically remove those DNS records that document that supplier B is using, because now I know that they're not being used, I can delete them. So for me, documentation out of detection is most important, but all four of these methods you can definitely basically use. So in terms of mitigation, so 4 steps, again, they're not in the order that some organizations might agree with. So first one for me would be to, if you've got a scenario where you basically have to mitigate the risk, or you're in a situation where you have to carry out mitigative measures because your DNS has been poisoned and things like that. Let's take that scenario. Then you of course need to identify and restore or remove the polluted records. And that could mean, for example, if it's an unauthorized access, you change your passwords. If it's DNS records that have been poisoned, hopefully you've got a backup that you can basically restore with the correct records. Hopefully the DNS supply can help you with that. If it's records that have been added, so newly created records, remove them. And if it's obviously traffic that's being redirected to a location that is not your location or the legitimate location, then you obviously redirect that traffic, the illegitimate traffic, back to the legitimate traffic. Second one is flushing DNS, because DNS caching is a thing. And again, typically associated with the TTL, so the time to live. But if you flush DNS, which is basically clearing your browser cache as a user, local DNS resolvers, or as the authoritative organization for the DNS records, update your TTLs to shorter TTLs, for example, and that way it forces the worldwide DNS resolvers to basically pick up those new records. That could also be a mitigative measure as well. Third one, necessarily doesn't have to be after these two, it could be before, of course, is carrying out root cause analysis. So in information security, if you're, for example, familiar with ISO 27001, that's quite important. So you would carry that out to understand where you went wrong, where you can improve, and obviously try and try and include measures to prevent it from happening in the future. And finally, depending on how big the situation, the damage control needs to be, you would need to inform some stakeholders on various levels. So that could be your clients, your users, your recipients, obviously customers, partners. For example, if they're working with you, with your organization, your security team, and of course your legal team, if there is a certain amount of damage control that needs to happen with their help. And finally, we come to the preventative measures. So there's quite a few more here. So first one is, and this is really important, so I've put in the brackets the actual topic that it's associated with. And what you'll see quite a few times here is process as well as basically suppliers. So all of these can be intertwined. So the first one is, again, whether it's DNS, for example, email infrastructure, you need to basically have a decommissioning process for DNS records and senders. So senders, in our case, obviously email suppliers, but it could be suppliers for web, for database, anything like that. You need to have a decommissioning process because that's a preventative measure. Second one is the mandatory user authentication. Sorry, Ivan, yeah, I'll let you say at the end about the TTL because I know you've got something to mention. So in terms of the second preventative measure, mandatory stronger user authentication. There are many cases like the one that I showed earlier, where if they had stronger authentication, single sign-on, for example, using multi-factor keys or hardware keys, that could have been a preventative measure compared to just having username and password. It's one that is, I think, underutilized quite a lot. Third one is access control. So that's basically based on your job profile, for example, should you have the permission to be managing a DNS critical infrastructure, especially if you don't actually know what you're doing. And this in this regards is a process. It needs to be something that the organization basically instills so that people at different levels understand how it should work. So whether that's obviously a password policy, defined roles, part of the job description when you're hiring someone, things like that, make sure that that is basically organization wide. Fourth one is change control and change management. Again, another process. There are suppliers of DNS that basically have this as part of the solution. Awesome. You can add notes, things like that. But if you don't have a change control, change management process, in my view, it's literally a ticking time bomb until something happens with unauthorized access or, for example, dangling DNS or something along those lines in terms of being abused. Number 5 is alerts and notifications. So again, you can use the DMARC data, your DNS supplier. Of course, if they have an alerting feature, have that. If you've got, for example, logs that you can leverage with like SIEM technology, Splunk, for example, to be notified on trends, analysis when, if you've got too many DNS records on a certain day, week, then of course, leverage that. But this is important. There's proactive and reactive. So utilize both, not one, you both, because again, one is real time, one is post the situation happening, like we saw with the DMARC data. Number 6 is avoid huge TTLs. So this, in my view, varies depending on the actual DNS record that we are talking about. So for example, for SPF records, when you're doing SPF changes, you should have low TTLs because your SPF record is not yet stable. So you want low TTL so that whenever you update the SPF record, the new changes are picked up as soon as possible. But once your SPF record becomes stable, for example, you're not going to change it every week, not even every month through 3 months, might be once a year, twice a year. Then, for example, you can increase the TTL between 1 and 4 hours to basically make it stable so that there's no frequent changes, so that the DNS resolver, whoever that is, Google and others, they're not having to pick up the SPF record often. And for me, again, what's most important is the documentation. So again, that should be part of both the detection, mitigation, preventative measures, because if you have documentation, then you're in a really good place to basically reduce the risk and potentially not have these scenarios occurring for your organization. And yeah, any questions and answers, please?
Thank you, Mo. That was phenomenal. Lots and lots of information in there. So thank you very much for taking us through such a comprehensive tour through DNS hygiene and mismanaged DNS. Ivan, I think you just wanted to come in on the TTL, so the time to live.
Yeah, thank you, Leanne. So that's maybe the most ignored option of the DNS, which is actually very important because the people don't realize that DNS query is not make on their own DNS server, but most of the people using Google ones or Cloudflare ones DNS servers. So TTL means how often the Google or the Cloudflare will refresh the results. That means if you have huge TTL, for example, 1 month, even more, we can see in the practice ridiculous volumes. That means if you find that something is wrong, the DNS will be not updated during 1 month. So even if you prevent and find the issue as soon as you can, then the reactive measure will maybe will take 1 month to be fixed. So that's why it's very important to have, like Mo says, very good TTO examples and numbers. The lower TTO is even worse because then lower than 1 minute or 5 minutes, for example, I have seen TTL 1 second, which means Google will refresh the DNS every single second. And that will cause the DNS temporers not able to resolve the proper records, and etc., which is also worse.
So if you were going to, putting you on the spot, if you were going to recommend the ideal TTL, taking into account what Mo said about not having it too short, but also what you're saying about not having it too long, what would you recommend?
Depends from the records, the type of the records, and the time of the DNS changes. If you're planning migration, before the migration, you have to lower the TTL because you need to change the DNS record fast. But once the migration is done, then you can raise the TTL, but keep it in normal values. For example, 1 day. It's not needed to be 1 week, because 1 week is in the internet. 1 week is decades.
Yeah. Thank you. We've got some time for Q&A. If anybody does have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and I can read them out. The old adage of there is no stupid question absolutely is the case in this instance, because we've just been given lots and lots of technical information. So if you do have a burning question, please do pop it in the Q&A. Mo, I'm going to come to you around the poll. The poll was exactly what you were expecting it to be. Why is it the case that you were expecting pretty much nobody to know what their DNS records were?
Sure, it's because I've worked with many customers from all different types of sectors and sizes, and not a single one of them could tell me what every single DNS resource record was being used for. So usually the case is, if you ask them, they know, for example, how much loo roll they have purchased as an organization, or how much coffee they've purchased. But if you ask them when it comes to, how many suppliers do you have, how many DNS records you have, usually the answer is I don't know, because they don't have a centralized place of that information. And usually it's not one person that has the answer, it's usually a few people. And that's again why it's important to have a centralized place where you have that information.
And when you talk about a centralized place, where would you expect that to be within an organization? And it relates to another question I had about documentation around. That's a big process. For an organization, if they don't already have these processes documented, it's quite a overwhelming task, I would imagine. So how does an organization start that, and where would you expect that to be owned?
Usually it's going to start when there's an issue. It's not going to be something that they do proactively, right? But if you are going to do it proactively, then someone needs to own this. And usually I would say, coming from like a security background, because I'm concerned about this stuff because it's critical infrastructure, I'm going to be the one that goes to the CEO and to senior management and that says, hey, look, it's a potential risk. Obviously, we haven't had any issues yet, any incidents yet, but it's something that could happen, because look at all of these incidents are happening across the real world. So for me, I'm going to push for this. And when it comes to actually organizing it, I can't do it by myself, because if you have multiple DNS providers, multiple suppliers, multiple infrastructure, that centralized location can't be with one supplier or the other supplier. It has to be with you as the organization. And usually that means using software to basically catalog all of those DNS resource records with, for example, who the supplier is that's using it and stuff like that. And then, of course, you need to keep that up to date, right? So in some cases, you can automate it. But at the end of the day, I'm old fashioned. I like to do things manually, and I like to keep an eye on things and make sure things are updated and cataloged correctly. If it's not, then I'm going to chase the person that's responsible for the supplier A or supplier B and say, are we using this supplier? Because I can see that the DNS resource records have been used, for X amount of time, because I can see no queries are being carried out. I'm going to get suspicious. Why do we have this supplier? It's a potential risk to, for Dangling DNS, for example.
Yeah. Well, you've segued very nicely into the next question that I had, which was about Dangling DNS, because there seems to be a lot of kind of threat vectors in relation to Dangling DNS, where it might be as a result of a typo or a supplier going out of business. So what's the best way to protect against, maybe not even protect, but to kind of keep an eye on who your suppliers are and what they're responsible for, so you can protect against that threat?
Yeah. So for me, because I've been working with DMARC since 2014, so quite a long time, DMARC data is something that everyone should be leveraging. Let's put aside the fact that you want to get to people's reject. When it comes to the information or the metadata that you can get, you can utilize it. So it's data first and foremost because it's metadata. But if you understand how you can use it, so let's use your example, for example, from the DMARC data, you've got IP addresses, right? You've got domain names, you've got date and timestamps. And then if you use a competent DMARC reporting platform, it would tell you, for example, where those messages have been sent from in terms of the supplier. Again, you see the DNS record, right? The SPF record, the domain name, the DKIM record, stuff like that. You can see all of that stuff. You can then basically use that to fill in your own documentation. You can see if that, for example, if it exists, if it doesn't exist, if you need to remove it. If you have third-party tools that allow you to, again, leverage that metadata to see, for example, within your own organization, have you actually sent this email or not? So take the IP address, take the domain name, take the date and timestamp, and use something like the advanced hunting tool that Microsoft offers, for example, or Google offers the email log analyzer. Take the DMARC data and leverage it with that to see, is my organization actually sending these emails, or do I potentially have an incident where someone has gained unauthorized access and is sending these authenticated emails?
Great. Thank
So
you,
you
Mo.
have to be, sorry, just to go to a point, you have to be creative, right? Don't think
Yeah.
in like black and white.
And I think you also have to be extremely proactive, which is
Oh yeah,
kind of
yeah,
where the documentation part of it comes in again. Okay,
yeah.
we have a new question. Is the industry ever going to get to the point that DMARC, SPF, DKIM, I hope I've said that right, are
Yep.
required for every business to have in place?
Well, I don't know if this person has heard of the Google, Yahoo, Microsoft sender requirements, but you have to now do SPF, DKIM in terms of authentication for emails, depending on certain volumes and types. So the reason why this is now happening is because the industry has for so long delayed the mandatory requirements for email authentication, SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, like your passport. It's an email passport in essence, right? So
Okay.
they delayed it so long. They've now required organizations, depending on, again, volume, if you're sending like 5,000 emails or more, then you have to do SPF and DKIM. It has to be aligned. So it's not just us, our organizations. The bad actors also have to do exactly the same thing. So now that we are on level playing fields, they have to utilize other methods to try and gain access, to try and spoof and stuff like that. So they are leveraging DNS now.
I mean, I must admit, that's one of the things I think that I was shocked about when we were talking about doing this webinar. And my question was, how do these people know that these vulnerabilities are there? And then you brought up just, the website and took the beginning of your presentation. It's like people are
Yeah.
actively looking for this. They've kind of created a whole industry
Yep.
out of it in and of itself. We do still have some time for questions. So if anybody has a burning question that they want to ask Mo and Ivan, please furiously type it into the Q&A box now before we start to wrap up. This is probably an unfair question, but I'm going to ask it anyway to Mo and you, Ivan. If there was one thing that you wanted the audience to go away after watching this webinar and you want them to do, or some action that you want them to take, or something, just one thing that you want them to remember about this webinar, what would it be? Ivan, I'm going to come to you first.
Okay, thank you. That would be to check the DNS records.
Okay.
And there is a simple explanation. Even the small businesses could be affected. Even they are more interested because they have old domains, which means domains have a few years of history. the small businesses are less protected. Good reputation of the domains, less protection. So
Yeah.
it's if I was a bad actor, of course I am not, I will pick up a small company with 1 or 2 domains which are registered, for example, 10 years ago.
Okay.
So everyone could be affected.
Yeah.
And it's simple. Just check the DNS records 1 per week or 1 per month, and make sure that you understood every single record which is pointing to third-party domains.
And when you say check, that's because you're looking for that potential spike that you weren't expecting.
Exactly.
Or, yeah. Okay. Thank you. Mo?
So for me, I'm going to stick to what you described me in terms of my bio. It's going to be documentation process,
Okay.
because you're not organized unless you have processes, communication. So for me, that's most important.
Okay. Thank you. We have another question. How important is MTA-STS, strict transport for server-to-server email, to protect against some of these types of attacks? Do the bad actors enable TLS for their mail servers? Do you want to take that one?
I'll let Ivan take that one.
Thank you. Thank you, Mo. So let's explain it as simple as possible. There could be a man between us. For example, if I talk with Mo, someone could be stand in front of me, for example, and translate to Mo something different, which I say. So MTA-STS is one of the protocols or the standards which ensure that the communication between the 2 email servers is encrypted and there is no man in the middle. That's the man in the middle attack. So that ensures the sender that is connected to the right mail server to send the email. For example, if I have to send email to Mo, MTA-STS is the way to verify that this is the server of Mo.
Okay.
So it's important part of the email security.
And what about the second part of that question, which is, do the bad actors enable TLS for their mail servers? Or did you answer that? And because I'm not very technical, I didn't understand it.
No, that's good to remind me. So the TLS is the way to encrypting the communication between the mail server. But if you are not have MTA-STS as a protocol, you can connect to remote mail server with TLS because the bad guys enable the TLS. So you will have the encrypted connection, but you cannot be sure that this remote server is the right one.
Okay.
It could be the server of the bad guys, and then they will receive the invoice, then open the PDF, change the IBAN, and resend the invoice to Mo. This could be happening.
Okay.
And then Mo will pay thousands of euros to the bad guys.
Mo, you have your hand up. You think you've got something to say about that?
I do. I want to, it's not necessarily counteracting what Ivan said, but you have to understand that you can't think of it like a box. You can do MTSTS. I'm all for open protocols, but if your underlying processes are not in place, like for example, your access control is not sufficient enough, you shouldn't even be thinking about MTSTS. You need to get these bare bones access control processes in place before you even think about that, because you can have MTSTS, but what if the bad actor gets into your DNS through unauthorized access and they change your MTSTS records or they remove it, for example? So it's important. What I've been saying 100% is important, but for me, it always comes down to the processes, the underlying things that can cause those situations.
And the access protocol is who is authorized within your organization to make changes to specific DNS records.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because I can
Okay.
tell you there's been multiple situations where certain people, in my view, for the client, and I've told them this, especially the ones that I have good relationships with, because I can talk to them frankly, certain people should not have DNS access because they don't even know what an SPF record is, or a DMARC record, or an MTSDS record.
I mean, I didn't know what an SPF record was before you came on and did the webinar, but I know a
That's
lot
good.
more now.
Thank you.
So I think that we've got 3 minutes. So if anybody has a final question for Mo and Ivan, please take advantage of having these two experts here with us. I think what I'm hearing is you need to check your DNS records. You need to have a proactive approach to DNS hygiene. It's not something that just kind of happens on its own. It's something you actually have to proactively do, and documentation is a really important part of that. We had an earlier question which came in slightly after the question I asked about documentation, which was, if you don't have documentation for records inside a large production zone, how do we go about auditing and building that documentation? Mo, I think you probably answered that when you were answering my previous question, but I don't know whether you've got anything else to add.
Yeah, sure.
As a
Yeah.
final note.
So DMARC data is one, right? It's free, it's open. If you use a DMARC reporting platform that's competent, then you get more data qualification. You can see who the sender is and additional stuff. But passive DNS is, in my view, underutilized. So with passive DNS, there are, again, tools out there that you can use. There's obviously paid solutions as well. If you have DNS records and you don't know what they are, as long as it's been in the public domain, you can use passive DNS to see, for example, what they pointed to like 20 years ago even.
Okay.
So passive DNS is the answer to that question in my view.
Awesome. Thank you. I think all that leaves for me to say really is a massive thank you to Mo and to Ivan, and also to all of you for joining us today. So whether you've joined us live or whether you're watching the recording, we hope that you found it really informative and you've learnt a lot of things about DNS hygiene, and also that you've hopefully taken some practical things away that you can then implement within your business. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Mo and Ivan, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.